So my talk today is Heroines and Trailblazers Who Called Montclair Home. And I think the toughest part for me on this particular job was to figure out which I wanted to include, because there were just so many to choose from. So I know somebody is going to be disappointed tonight that I didn't choose the person that you really admire. I apologize in advance, but do me a favor and afterwards let me know who those people are, because I really want to know. This is sort of an evolving thing for me right now. So why are we doing it tonight? It's because it, as I mentioned before, is the 100th anniversary of the passing of the 19th Amendment. It happened on June 4th. We got the vote with the required 2/3 majority. Until then, women were allowed to vote in certain states. Certain states had given them the suffrage, but not every state. So this was the federal government saying, yes, indeed, women, you could vote. But then it took a while for it to be ratified by the 35 states that needed to ratify it in order to bring it into law. The last one, the 35th, was Tennessee, and that happened a year later in August of 1920. It was certified about a week after that, turning it into law. And then in the November election, 8 million women voted. Now, who'd they vote for? Who ran in the 1920 election? Anybody have any clue? All right, who said Warren Harding? Yeah, and there's the Jeopardy champion. There we go. Yes, exactly. It was Warren Harding. He beat out James Cox, and both of them were newspaper publishers, which I found really quite interesting. This picture is kind of interesting. That is the Montclair Equal Suffrage League marching in New York City, probably about a year or two before the 19th Amendment was passed. There were a group of women who kind of were trying to figure out how to do this whole suffrage thing. I actually wrote a two-part series in the Montclair Neighbors magazine. If you don't get Montclair Neighbors, because I know it doesn't go out to everybody, it's now on our website, and you can read them if you go to montclairhistory.org. On the top, there's a tab that says Montclair History, and then it says either cool links or interesting articles. Go to interesting articles, and you can see it there. Coming across in our archives, I found, interestingly, a first-person write-up from a woman in the 1950s who refused to be identified, but she told all about her experiences starting the Equal Suffrage League back in 1912. So it's really quite interesting. So how did I choose who I chose? Well, first of all, I wanted to make sure that they covered a wide range of areas. I didn't want to have all social reformers. I didn't want to have everybody who was an engineer or a scientist. So I tried to go across there. Then I looked at how long they lived in Montclair. And then I looked at what were their breakthroughs. There are a lot of women who did a lot of really great things, but they weren't necessarily the first ones to do it. So that's kind of my criteria that I looked for as I started to identify them. And my very first one broke all those criteria because she really didn't live in Montclair very long, and that's Lucy Stone. But I figured since I was doing this because it was the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, I would really be remiss if I didn't include her. So we're going to look at Lucy Stone first. She was born in Coys Hill, Massachusetts in 1818. Her family had been here since 1635. They had fought in the French and Indian War. Her grandfather was a captain in the American Revolution. And her parents were Hannah Matthews and Frances Stone. She was the 8th of 9 children in her family. And her father ruled with an iron fist and felt that he was the man of the house and his way was the only way. So as she said later, there was only one will in our home, and that was the will of my father. Now, somehow she convinced her parents to let her go to college in Oberlin, which I find rather remarkable. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall to hear those conversations. And she graduated in 1847. She was the first woman to receive a college degree in Massachusetts and one of the earliest ones in the United States. She immediately begins lecturing on equal rights for women and the justice of slavery. She became so well known in that period that she was hired by the American Anti-Slavery Society, and she got on their lecture circuit. Now, even when she was talking about abolition, she was also talking about women's rights, because, as she said, I am a woman first. So it never quite was only abolition, it was the rights of everybody in the United States. She would get hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. They weren't all in favor of what she had to say. There were times when she had bricks thrown at her, pepper thrown at her. They called her a hyena. They threw prayer books at her, I guess with the hope that maybe with osmosis she would get the right picture. But nonetheless, she prevailed, or persisted, as the case may be. She helped organize the first Women's Rights Convention in October 1850. And one of the things that came out of that was she published the proceedings. And Susan B. Anthony happened to read one of the proceedings, was so taken by what she said that she was the one who got Susan B. Anthony into the whole fight for women's rights. Cool, huh? That's not a bad legacy to have. I love the bigger picture of her because you notice she's wearing pants. Those were bloomers. That was a signal of the emancipation, that it was a symbol of emancipation, so it was showing how she wanted the women's rights. She had always said she would never get married because when you got married during that period, you would lose all of your rights. But there was a suitor named Henry Blackwell who very gently wooed her for about 2 years. And finally, she gave in and she married him. But I love the description of their wedding. She said she would love and honor, but refused to say she'd obey. And then together, as part of their vows, they read a protest of women's inequality. Can you imagine that as part of your vows? But they did. They'd written it together, and she kept her maiden name, also highly unusual for that period. So Lucy Stone was always Lucy Stone. Now, after they got married, Blackwell takes a job in New York City for in the publishing business, book publishing business. She gets pregnant and gives birth to that little baby on the picture. That's Alice. And they move to Orange. And she kind of, after the baby and with the Civil War, she kind of takes a step back from her speaking engagements. On January 22, 1858, Henry Blackwell is out of town and the tax collector comes knocking at her door. And she refuses to pay the taxes. She says, I'm not represented. It's the old taxation without representation thing, right? I'm not represented. I'm not paying any taxes. So the tax collector comes around and starts selling off all of her property, or enough of the property to cover the taxes. So they sold Alice's cradle. They sold a couple of engravings. They sold some tables, but her friends and her neighbors were all behind her, and so they bought everything and then gave it back to her once the tax collector left. So Lucy has enough of Orange, so she moves to Montclair, which I find hysterical because how many people move to Montclair because of the taxes? Who knew? She moves to Montclair and moves into this house at 118 North Mountain that's still there today, and raises her child, but also raises vegetables and fruits in order to make some extra money, I guess, for when the tax collector does come around again. She in 1867, she helps to found the New Jersey Women's Suffrage Association in Vineland, and then in 1869, she moves back to Massachusetts. So she really wasn't in Montclair very long, but we like to claim credit to Lucy Stone here. She also helped to organize the American Equal Rights Association, which fought for both African American and women's suffrage. She becomes president of the New Jersey Women's Suffrage Association and then leader of the American Women's Suffrage Association. Now, this is different from the National Women's Suffrage Association. National Women's Suffrage Association was trying to get women the right to vote on a national level. The American, the one she was with, was saying, let's try and do this on a state-by-state basis. It's a lot easier for us to nibble away at the states than it is to get the whole United States on board. She also founded and financed Women's Journal, which was a journal for women's rights, and her daughter Alice took over after she passed away. And in 1890, both the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association joined together as the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So they were finally working together as of 1890. Lucy passed away in 1893, and her parting words to her daughter were, "Make the world better." Go Lucy, yeah, okay. Next one is Lillian Moeller GILBRETH. She was born in 1878 and died in 1972, and everybody thinks of her because of Cheaper by the Dozen. But my goal here is to show that she was more than just a womb, that she really had a lot going for her. She was born in Oakland to William Moeller and Annie Delger. She was the oldest of 8 children, so 12 was really nothing in comparison to the 8, right? But her mother was very frail, and so who got to take care of all the kids? Lillian. And they didn't start her in school until she was 9-year-old because she was considered too sensitive, although I wonder if it was just because mom needed the help around the house. At first, when she told her parents that she wanted to go to college, her father said absolutely not. He fought against it, and finally she said, "Look, I'll go to UC Berkeley." She was living in California. "I'll go to UC Berkeley, and then I can stay home." He agreed to do that. She graduates with a bachelor's in literature in 1900, and then continues with a master's in English literature in 1902. She finishes and decides it's time for her grand tour of Europe. And she goes over, and who does she meet but Frank Bunker GILBRETH, who was a major building contractor in Boston. Falls in love with him even though he was significantly older than her. He not only was a building contractor, but he was becoming known for his motion studies and his search for what was called the one best way. So you're brushing your teeth, let's put it in easy terms, you're brushing your teeth. You can go across the top, across the bottom, up and down. What's the best way to do it? They would look at it and say, okay, here's the one best way to brush your teeth based on all of the motions that you have to take. You know, if you have to go here to here, that's one extra motion. If you go here to here, it's one motion. So that's what they were looking at, how to make life as efficient as you possibly can. So she moves out to the East Coast with him. She gets her PhD from Brown University, but instead of sticking with English literature, now she's looking at psychology. Because what she's trying to figure out is how can I take some of this motion study but add the human element into it? If people don't like to do this with their teeth as opposed to this with their teeth, nobody's going to do it anyway, so we have to add the psychology into the whole mix. So they continue to work. She convinces him to give up his career as a building contractor and rather to focus on their science together, their engineering studies, and they do. They move to this area because their reputation was beginning to grow, and being in the New York area made more sense for them than the Boston area. And they moved to Montclair in 1919, and they purchased this home on Eagle Rock Way, 68 Eagle Rock Way. If you're looking for familiarity, it's not there. This is what's there now. That was from Zillow a couple of years ago. And they begin to continue to build their reputation in time and motion studies. They also began to apply this whole philosophy to their kids. And that's what Cheaper by the Dozen is all about, the GILBRETH system that they used, the one best way to raise a family, to have them take care of the chores, etc. Now, if you go online, I just pulled one picture out of it, but if you go online, Frank GILBRETH has hundreds of hours of silent films where he's filming these motion studies. It's pretty remarkable. And you can see up there what they were doing was they were analyzing the motions that somebody would take to lay bricks, to package soaps, to do household chores. And they began to put these things together and say, okay, what can we do with this? They published studies on it, they published books about it. And Frank never had a strong education. Lillian certainly did, so although the books all went out under his name because he was a he, and it was at the time, she was really the author behind all of them. He died in 1924. Anybody know where he died? At the train station, that's right. He went to work, and in the middle of the train station waiting room, poor Frank passes away. And Lillian is concerned that the consulting business is going to go, fall apart because people wanted to work with a man, not a woman. And so she is determined to keep the business going. So 3 days after his death, she gets on a boat and sails to Europe because she wants to deliver the speech that he was supposed to deliver in Europe later that month. And she does continue to grow the business. She also begins, as one of her clients, she had General Electric, and so she begins looking at the home and how to create the one best way to do things in the home. And there was also an increasing interest from groups like General Electric as to, what can we do for the homemaker? How can we sell things now to the homemaker to make their life easier? And so she applies these motion studies and management to the home. When you go to get your kitchen designed and they tell you need your work triangle? You can thank LILLIAN GILBRETH for that. She was the one who invented the work triangle. She was the one who said, this is the right height for a sink. This is the right height for a stove. For her, the one best way meant it's the least exertion for somebody, it's the greatest happiness for somebody, and it's the most increased productivity. So to prove that her kitchen triangle worked so well, she decided that she was going to publish a study where they compared how many steps it took to bake a strawberry shortcake if you use the old way versus her way. And the remarkable results is that the number of steps decreased from 281 steps to build a strawberry shortcake all the way down to 45. So now you know what to do when you're about to build a strawberry shortcake. Anyway, Lillian goes on to become the first female professor at Purdue University. She's the first woman elected to the National Academy of Engineers. She's the second woman elected to the American Society of Mechanical Engineering. She's the first woman to receive the Hoover Award, which is an award that's given out by five engineering organizations for someone that has great, unselfish, non-technical services by engineers to humanity. She got 20 honorary degrees. She was awarded several patents. Okay, you open your refrigerator door and you've got the little thing with the eggs and the butter on either side, the shelves. That was Lillian. You go to the push garbage can, the foot pedal garbage can. That was Lillian. She also had some other things like wastewater hoses for clothes washers and things like that. Were not nearly as exciting, but I kind of think of her now every time I open my refrigerator door and see my butter drawer. And so she lived in Montclair most of her adult life when she was raising children. So that's why she gets the honor here.
She was an honorary member of this club.
And she was an honorary member of the Women's Club, and that's why she's in this presentation.
We have it in a Quest magazine.
Do you?
I literally randomly opened one
Wow,
day,
so
and
cool.
it was talking about her as an honorary.
Well, that's cool. That's neat. Next one I want to talk about is ALTHEA Gibson. ALTHEA was born in August 25th, 1927, passed away in September 2003. Didn't live in Montclair that long, but I thought her accomplishments warranted her being here. Her parents were sharecroppers down in South Carolina. They moved to Harlem in 1930, and the apartment that she was living in backed up to an area that was designated as a police athletic league playground, basically. So she went out there and she learned how to play things like ping pong. And after a while, ping pong grew into tennis. And she's introduced to that, and within like 2 years, she begins playing for the American Tennis Association, which was a primarily African-American tennis organization. She dominates that circuit. She won 12 out of 13 championships from 1944 to 1956. And she begins to get frustrated. I don't have the competition here. I want to play with the big guys. I want to play Wimbledon. I want to play the US national championships. And so she begins to think, maybe I should just bag this and go into the military. At that point, right around that point, there was a woman named Alice Mabel. And Alice Mabel had been a #1 tennis champion prior. And she writes in American Lawn magazine that this is ridiculous, that we're not giving people of ALTHEA Gibson's caliber the opportunity to play to play Wimbledon, to play the U.S. Open, to play the French Open. And so that kind of changes everything for Althea. She's the first African American woman to play the U.S. National Championships, which today we know of as the U.S. Open. In the 1950s, this is all. 1951, she becomes the first African American woman to play Wimbledon. 52, she's now in the top 10 of American players, female players. By 53, she's edged up to number 7. By 1956, she wins the French Open. 57, she wins the U.S. National Championships and Wimbledon, and AP names her as the African American Athlete of the Year. She basically repeats that in 1958, becomes the U.S. National Championship again, and Wimbledon, and AP's Female Athlete of the Year. And then in 1959, she decides she's going to turn professional. In the midst of all this glory, though, she's fighting segregation. She says, according to ESPN, there was a story that said that she was refused rooms in certain cities that she played in. She wanted to book reservations for a luncheon in her honor and was not allowed to. And that she was even in some places changing for the match in her car because they wouldn't let her into the dressing rooms. So she was beginning to get a little frustrated by that, and she decides to turn professional. But when she turns professional, there really were no professional tours for women in those days, and so money became a big issue. And she said, and I quote, "Being the queen of tennis is all well and good, but you can't eat a crown. Nor can you send the Internal Revenue Service a throne clipped to their tax forms. The landlord and grocer and tax collector are funny that way. They like cold cash. I reign over an empty bank account, and I'm not going to fill it by playing amateur tennis." And so then she starts a whole series of different venues to try and make some money. First, she plays a series of matches before the Harlem Globetrotters games. She becomes a professional singer, releasing an album called Althea Gibson Sings in '59. She played Lukey in the movie Horse Soldiers. Has anybody seen that movie? I've never seen it. My husband, believe it or not, had. But she played that, but the part I love about that is they gave her the script and it had like really traditional African-American slave dialect. And she just goes, I'm not doing that. And so if you watch Horse Feather or Horse Soldiers, you don't see that in there, which is kind of interesting. She joined the she writes a memoir, I Always Wanted to Be Somebody. She joined the LPGA, becoming the first African-American player in 1964, and played there until 1978. And then in 1976, she becomes the New Jersey Commissioner of Athletics, and then served on the State Athletics Control Board until '68, and ultimately the Governor's Council on Physical Fitness until '92. So what's her connection to Montclair? Well, early in her career, she met Rosemary Darden of Montclair, who was another tennis player, and she winds up marrying her brother in 1965. The picture up on top is from Jet magazine. And they live at 69 Pleasant Way, which is the picture down below. She divorced Darden in 76. She married an old tennis coach of hers in '83, divorced him in '88. And when she passed away, she was buried in Rosedale. She's part of our Rosedale Cemetery tour, as a matter of fact. And you won't find her grave there because her name isn't on it. She was buried in the same plot as her first husband, William Darden, and she didn't want her name on her stone. And so it's not there. So we go and we visit William Darden's stone, but that's where Althea is as well. She is recognized elsewhere that she had a stamp in her honor, and there is a statue now at Branch Brook Park that went up probably only 4 or 5 years ago. Anybody? Around that time? CARLEEN Hutchins is our next woman. Yay, you like CARLEEN? Oh, yay, okay. So CARLEEN Hutchins is a scientist and a luthier, which that was my new word for the presentation tonight. Luthier is someone who makes violins. Who knew, right? I didn't, at least. Born in 1911, died in 2007. Her parents were Thomas William Maley and Grace Fletcher. They moved to Montclair when she was just 2 years old. Kelly, she loved Girl Scouts and woodworking and all outdoors and sports. She grew up on 112 Essex Avenue, which at the time was very rural, And so she would go out in her backyard and she'd play with snakes and bugs and just have a wonderful old time. She went to Montclair High School, graduated probably in 1929, but I haven't been able to verify that with a yearbook. She played first trumpet. She'd actually learned to play trumpet on a bugle and worked her way through camp playing bugle, starting when she was 8 years old. But she played first trumpet in the band and orchestra, which at the time was verboten. Women did not play trumpet. And she also, her mother insisted that she took shop instead of home ec. So yeah, probably the first woman to ever take shop in Montclair High School. And that served her well in the future. She goes to Cornell University, she gets a BA in biology, studying nothing other than bugs, entomology, and decides that she wanted to go to med school, but then really couldn't put the finances together, so she starts teaching science at a private school in New York, where she taught for 15 years. And while she was there, she learned to play the viola. And the reason she learned to play the viola is because she took her trumpet to a faculty chamber music group and started to play, and the trumpet obviously is going to make a lot more sound than some of the other instruments that are there. And so they basically told her to come back after she'd learned how to play the viola, which she then did. So she picked up a viola for like $75 at the time, and she was very upset with the quality of the instrument. And so she vowed that she would make a better one. And so she did. She began studying under different luthiers. One was Carl Berger. Another one was a Harvard physicist who was studying violin acoustics. She also studied with Fernando Sacconi, who was a Stradivarius expert. And so she begins to start building her one viola, but then that kind of keeps going because she now wants to take what people like Stradivarius did with love and art and all this, and she wants to put science to it. She wants to know how to make scientifically the best possible instrument she could. So she creates a whole set of violas, and now she's moved back home, by the way, because she can't do all this when she's raising a family, and her family still lives in Montclair, so she moves back to Montclair. Her mom takes care of her kids while she goes and studies with all these guys, and she starts using the Montclair home as sort of her workshop. And she buys all these oscilloscopes, which are instruments that are used for acoustical science experiments, and she begins testing vibrations and air movement, and if you make the ribs a little bit higher versus a little bit lower, and if you take the F holes and you move them up instead of down, what happens to it? And so she begins experimenting with the sounds of that. And through that process, she invented something called free plate tuning. And the way she describes it is you take the free plate, which is the top and the bottom, the big piece of the instrument, and you put Christmas glitter on it. And then you apply vibrations, air vibrations to it, or vibrations to it, and the glitter begins to separate. And where the glitter gathers, that needs to be shaved off just a whisker so that you could get the right sound. And it was through that experimentation that she began to develop better and better instruments that were beginning to get used by some of the really famous orchestra or violinists of the world. She and her colleagues form the Catgut Acoustical Society, and she begins to get more and more noticed and earns a reputation for the high quality of her instruments. And then in 1957, she's asked by composer Henry Brandt to develop a series of instruments. And the instruments, they turned out to be the violin octet, is what it's called. And they start real small and they get to real big. And I'm not a violinist, so I really can't tell you exactly how they change, but when you play them together, and you can actually go online and listen to them, it's amazing. The sound of the violins, or from the littlest to the biggest together, really create a very harmonious sound, very rich, deep sound. And so she became known for this octet. Now, not a lot of people know that octet, but her instruments have been played by people like Yo-Yo Ma and other pretty famous people, so she's competing with the big people in this one. All in all, she built about 500 instruments. She published scientific papers, including 2 benchmark ones, this one in Scientific America in 1981. She created this new palette of sound with this octet. And then she also taught many luthiers from her home. From what I read, her home was sort of like very eccentric. You know, you'd have catgut hanging from one thing, you'd have pieces of the instrument on another, you'd have the whole instruments together elsewhere. She had a pet squirrel that she'd feed, and it was quite a unique place to live.
She had a pet crow, too.
A pet crow, too, thank you. Pet squirrel, pet crow, maybe I got the crow wrong. Well, anyway. And one of the things that somebody in one of the obituaries said is many famous artists come to life after they pass away. Let's hope for CARLEEN that is the case, because people don't often know about CARLEEN still. So that's one of our quests, to let people know about CARLEEN. Next person is Norma Jean Darden. Who has her cookbook? Strawberry, spoon bread and strawberry wine, thank you. Norma Jean, that's not why we're talking about her. We're talking about her because of her fashion career. I'm sorry, let me just slip back. She was born to the parents, her parents were Dr. Walter Darden and Mamie Jean. They moved to Montclair from Newark in 1947, and they moved into 266 Orange Road. Norma Jean was part of our Norma was part of our documentary that we did when we called A Place to Become, about the YWCA. And she tells the story about how she moved to Newark, and in Newark everything was busy and hustling and bustling, and then she moves to Montclair, and there are crickets, and there's all this nature, and she didn't know what to do with it. She attended Nishuane School, then went to a boarding school in Massachusetts, graduating from Sarah Lawrence with a BA in Liberal Arts in '61, and her sister Carol, who will enter the picture later, graduated in 1966. She then entered the fashion world and became a fashion model for Wilhelmina Models, which was quite a coup for her. She appeared in Bazaar, she appeared in Glamour, Mademoiselle, and Vogue, but then probably the crowning jewel was when she was invited to be one of 10 African-American models to appear in the Battle of Versailles in 1973. Now, I had no idea what this was. But apparently what they did was they needed to raise money to fix up Versailles, you know, because Versailles was looking a little shabby. And so they decided they were going to create this battle where they were going to pit the American fashion designers versus the French fashion designers. And everybody who was anybody attended the Battle of Versailles. And the French come in and they do their traditional runway stuff. And then the American come in, and all of a sudden you have a third of the models are African American, which was highly unusual. It was the beat was different. There was some African beat in there. There was bright colors, vivid colors. A lot of it was based on the modern world of 1973. Think of what fashion looked like in 1973. And so it changed fashion history. Everybody stood up and applauded when the Americans were done because it had totally changed fashion industry. It established a new portrait of what American fashion looked like. And as one article talked about, something that was in the Washington Post, it said, the 36 models represented the American mosaic: ivory-skinned redheads, blue-eyed blondes, honey-toned and ebony-skinned African Americans, and sun-kissed brunettes. It was a perfectly optimistic picture, a portrait of American beauty that had been forged out of riots, cultural soul-searching, friendships, politics, and a subtle subtext of racial fearfulness that ran through American life. So she continued in her modeling career until 1975, when a medical problem stopped her from that. She did, however, win in 2011 the Huffington Post Game Changer Award for being part of that Battle of Versailles. So she and her sister began collecting family stories, and they opened a catering business. They published Spoon Bread and Strawberry Wine in 1978 with recipes, family histories, and overall history of the African American experience. She opened 3 restaurants, one of which is still in existence in Harlem. And she's still very much alive and active, and if you ever happen to be in Harlem and you're looking for a place to go, it's wonderful. And the last person I want to talk about is Emily Blackwell. Now, everybody knows Elizabeth Blackwell, right? Well, a lot of people know Elizabeth Blackwell, more certainly than Emily Blackwell. Elizabeth Blackwell was the first the first female physician in the United States. And she was Emily's older sister. Emily was the number 3 female physician in the United States. And, you know, as the third one, you really don't get the same kind of press that you do if you're the first one. But she came from a family that was quite distinguished. Samuel and Blackwell and Hannah Lane lived in England. He had a sugar refining business. And their kids really did an amazing thing. You had Henry, who we talked about before, who married Lucy Stone. You have Elizabeth Blackwell, who became the first medical doctor in the United States, female. Anna was a newspaper columnist. Samuel married another suffrage leader named Antoinette Brown, and she was an ordained minister. And then you had teachers and writers and artists and other people in the family tree as well. Anyway, Samuel's business falls apart in 1832, and so he immigrates to the United States with his family, and they set up shop in Jersey City. However, in Jersey City, a fire destroyed the new refinery, and so now he's stuck again. What am I going to do? So he moves the family to Cincinnati for yet another new start. And he tried another sugar refinery, but then he died in 1838, and basically the older kids were left trying to help the family make ends meet and survive. During that time, they also got involved in abolition, which is why you begin to see people like Henry Blackwell in there. And Emily, who's a teacher, decides, okay, it's time for a career change. I'm going to follow in my big sister's footsteps. And she does. So she applies to 12 different medical colleges, and nobody will let her in because she's a woman. And so she finally gets into Rush College in Chicago. She's there for 1 year, and they kick her out because the patients don't like having a female physician attend to them. So she transfers to Western University, which is now Case Western, and she graduates in 1854, which I find remarkable. Can you imagine getting a medical degree in 1 year or 2 years? She does. She graduates in 1854. She goes to Scotland to study obstetrics and gynecology and begins to find backers for this dream that she and her sister have of starting an infirmary here in the United States, which they do. In 1857, Elizabeth, Emily, and another doctor, who is affectionately known as Dr. Zach because nobody can deal with that last name, opened the New York Infirmary for Indigent Women and Children. It's the first infirmary dedicated to women and children in the United States, and it's the first one with an all-female staff. During the Civil War, they trained Union nurses for the Union side through an organization called the Women's Central Association of Relief. And then they continued, after the war, they continued to get increasingly frustrated by the lack of opportunities for women who want to study medicine. So what do? You open up your own medical college. And they did. In 1868, they opened the Women Medical College, adjacent to the infirmary that they had opened before. And then Elizabeth hightails it back to Europe. And so Emily's basically sitting there going, I guess I'm running this place myself. And from what I read, there might have been some bad blood between the sisters as well. Don't know the whole story, but Emily proves to be very capable of doing this and growing the operation throughout the 1870s. It was the first medical school to establish a 4-year curriculum, thank goodness. And in 1894, they also open a program for nurses as well. Love this picture. Can you see what it is? It's an illustration of the medical college, and there's a woman presenting up in front with a cadaver. Do you see that?
Yes, yes.
The cadaver on the table, and then all of the women in their long skirts are all gathered around watching the procedure. Love that picture. In 1883, she purchases a home on 17 Plymouth Street with her partner, Dr. Elizabeth Kusher, who is also a physician at the infirmary, and together they adopt a daughter, Nanny. But by the time 1899 rolls around, Cornell University Medical College and some other colleges are beginning to accept women in the medical industry. And so she decides that it's time to close their women's college, their women's medical college, which she does. She makes sure all of the students can get into and get transferred over to Cornell, and then closes the doors in 1899 and retires in 1900 to her home here. She travels for 18 months in Europe after she retires, then winters in Montclair and summers up in York Cliff, Maine, and traveled a lot to California or Southern Europe. From what I understand, she was briefly united with Elizabeth in 1906, and they both passed away within months of each other in 1910. So those are the big ones. Some quick takes, as I called them. Marion Thompson Wright lived in Montclair for a short time, which is why she didn't make the top one, but she was the first African-American woman to earn a PhD in history in the United States, and literally wrote the book on the history of African-American education in the United States, and her research was used in the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case. Beatrice Alex Hicks, another name that most people don't know about. She was born in 1919, died in 1979. She was the first female engineer that Western Electric hired. She was president of an engineering firm called Newark Controls, and she invented the gas density switch. I'm going to read this because I'm not going to get it right otherwise. It monitors the density of sealed-in atmospheres and signaled when there was a change in density, which signaled a leak. And because of that gas density switch, we were able to land on the moon. She lived in Montclair from 1948 to 1963. Mary Hayes Allen moved to Montclair in 1920. She bought a house on Valley Road. She was the daughter of a Confederate soldier and his enslaved domestic servant. She was active in the YWCA and also the NAACP. She became president of the Montclair chapter, and she led numerous protests in theaters and stores and other organizations. And some of them were like obvious, protests, the way we think of a protest, but some of them, there's a story about how she had her daughter keep going back to the same hairdresser over and over and over again, who refused to cut her hair because she was black. And finally, after countless visits, she wore them down. And so now, after that, they started cutting anyone's hair who walked in the door. So some of it was a little bit more subtle, and some of it was really overt protests. That's Mary Hayes Allen. No. Oh, yes, she's the graduation one. You want me to tell that story too? Okay. So it's because of Mary Allen Hayes that, that the Montclair High School graduation line was integrated in 1930. Prior to that, all the white children would walk in front, and then all the black children would follow. Students, children, they were 18. But she walked into the principal's office and said, "My daughter is graduating, and her last name is Allen. I expect she'll walk at the front of the line." Now, Mary was quite light-skinned, and her first daughter was quite light-skinned. And so the principal said, "Yes, Mrs. Allen, of course that's what's going to happen." And then she said, "Good." And then she went down through the rest of her children who were not as light-skinned. And the principal realized he'd been had, and he said, "Well, I'm not sure I can do that. I may have to talk to the Board of Education for this." And Mrs. Hayes basically, or Mrs. Allen said, "I'm sorry, if you do that, I'm going to pull my daughter out in the middle of the graduation ceremony and move her to the front of the line where she belongs, and you certainly don't want that kind of scene." And because of that, the line has been integrated ever since. So.
Go, Mary.
Alice HOOE Foster, she was the first African-American woman to graduate from Montclair High School. She was one of the founders of the Glenridge YWCA, chairman of its board of managers, but she also owned HOOE Hall, which was at 415 Bloomfield Avenue, which is pretty far up the avenue for an African-American business during that period. So she and her sister bought this. They ran their own business out of it. They had a hairdresser. She used it for the Y, for functions for the Y as well, but they also rented space to a lot of people. A dentist, a dry goods store, a laundry. There were some residents there as well. So it was really quite unique for someone of that age, or in that age, of that color and that gender to have their own business on Bloomfield Avenue. Stella Bradford, who almost made the cut for the top part, but didn't quite. She is the oldest daughter, or the oldest child of Reverend Dr. Amory Howe Bradford. She became a physician, not the first or third, but she became a physician early on. But she pioneered the use of physical therapy to treat disabled children and adults. She also established the Fresh Air School. Has anybody heard of this at Nishuane? This is fascinating. I want to learn more about this one. So during the TB epidemics, what they did to try and stop the spread, they created an open-air school at Nishuane, and there's a picture of it in the Montclair Public Library's Digital Images Archive. And it's basically a tent with half wooden walls in the middle of winter with snow all around it. But the idea was that the germs couldn't settle anywhere, that it was open air, so it was therefore more healthy. These kids must have frozen in the middle of winter, but nonetheless, they didn't get TB, so I suppose that's a good thing. So that's Stella Bradford. And then there were so many more. Hortense Ridley Tate, who was hired as the Girl Reserve Secretary for the YWCA. She came out when she was 21 years old in 1920 and became a guiding light for the Y for countless years and many generations. Martha Bell Williams was the first African-American woman, one of two African-American women admitted to the New Jersey State Bar in 1949. Lily Connor started up the daycare center at Frog Hollow, was a social justice reformer. Inez Bull, who is known for her family's background in music, and she started a music festival and a museum to honor Ole Bull, who was one of her ancestors. But what I found interesting about her was that she was also a musician herself and used music in the treatment to work with kids with special needs. And she sort of changed the way people perceived that children with special needs could be dealt with. She brought kids from this one special needs group to performing concerts at Carnegie Hall. I mean, it was pretty amazing. Jane Barris, who was active in the New Jersey League of Women Voters and was actually one of only eight female delegates who rewrote or amended the New Jersey Constitution in 1947. Catherine Gamble, Montclair Art Museum director from 1952 to 1980. She was the youngest woman in the field, and also it was a field dominated by men. Emily Greenow, who was one of the members of the Artist Colony, who worked for Lafarge Studios and did a lot of the faces on stained glass windows. And Jessie Redmond Faust, who was a prolific African-American novelist long before that was a common thing. And I'm sure this is where I got some of my sources. There's probably a lot more than that. And I'm sure there are a lot more women that maybe are some I didn't touch on, and I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.